Well, this is live in Hiroshima, Japan, where the G7 summit has already begun, and what is happening right now is that the leaders or the delegates and the heads of state who have gathered for the G7 summit are currently posing for the photo op at the Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima. This is very symbolic. As you can see, these are some of the prime ministers and the heads of state who are attending this crucial summit in Hiroshima in Japan. We have the US President Joe Biden, we have the Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida, who is actually showing the delegates and the heads of state and also the prime ministers of why this Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park is symbolic, not only for Japan, but for the world. And like I said, the G7 summit has already begun. So what happens is that the G7 leaders or the delegates and the heads of state and the prime ministers who attend the G7 summit have to pause for a photo op just before the delegation or the speech or the gathering commences. This is live in Hiroshima, Japan, where the group of 7 nations are gathering for the Hiroshima summit, which is about to commence in a few minutes from now after this photo op. And we have countries like the United States, we have UK, we have Japan, we have Italy, we have Canada, who are going to attend this summit. India will be an observer state in this summit. And we already know that the leaders of the G7 countries have already arrived, and this is at the historic Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. Now the leaders who are on your screen right now, we have the Canadian Prime Minister, we have the Italian Prime Minister there, we have the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, we also have the President of the United States, Joe Biden, we have the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, we have the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. They have posed for a group picture in front of the Peace Memorial in Hiroshima. This is quite symbolic because it signifies why this Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima is important not only for Japan, but to the whole world. They will begin the first plenary session of the 3-day summit in a short while from now. The main agenda is expected to be on imposing fresh sanctions against Russia, and the United Kingdom has already announced fresh sanctions against Russia's minerals sector. This, in particular, targets the imports of diamonds as well as aluminum, copper and nickel in a bid to choke Moscow's ability to fund the war in Ukraine. So the heads of state and the prime ministers and the president of the European Commission will head for a plenary of this 3-day summit in Hiroshima, Japan, which commences a few minutes from now. Like I said, WION World is One. We'll be covering this 3-day summit. Our principal correspondent, Sidhant Sibol, is live in Hiroshima. Sidhant Sibol, good to see you. Probably what can we expect on the first day of this 3-day summit?
Well, on the first day, we are right now witnessing those visuals of the leaders paying homage to those who died during the atomic bombing of the city. We know that the city is deeply scarred and remains so, and that has been part of the policy of the local as well as the Japanese foreign ministry, that the world should be without nuclear weapons. Now, homage will be paid, and we know those visuals, informal settings, something that is part of various summits. But then, of course, the hard conversations takes place. This today, of course, will be the day when the first day of the conversations will take place. And as we have been talking about since yesterday, that the shadow of Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Chinese aggressive actions are dominating the conversations here at the G7 summit in Hiroshima. But also focus will be on trying to form consensus on issues like climate change, clean technology, artificial intelligence. So when the conversations happen, it is given that the Ukrainian side is expected to also participate. It's not announced in what format the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, is going to participate, but it's given that he is going to be present virtually, because last year as well in Germany, where WION was present, President Zelensky had participated at the summit virtually. Then, of course, as the days progress, we know that this is a 3-day meeting. There will be a joint statement that will be issued on Sunday, and then joint statement is going to focus on the action the G7 countries are planning against Russia, given that it has been involved in a conflict, in a major conflict in Europe. We know that already UK has taken action by banning diamonds from Russia. The American side could also announce fresh set of sanctions against President Putin and Russian government. So that remains a key priority. But this entire summit also provides opportunity for larger engagement. We know that Japan has invited new set of countries. India, of course, is being invited since 2019 regularly. This will be Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 4th G7 summit, and he's also attending the summit as the chair of the G20 grouping as well. So what India is going to say and what stance India is going to take when it comes to various geopolitical issues is something that will be closely watched.
Siddhant Sibol, let's talk more about your last point there, about the states or the countries that have been invited as observer states during this summit. We have countries like Australia, Brazil, India, like you mentioned, Indonesia, South Korea, and Vietnam. What roles are these countries going to play in this summit?
Well, if you look at the countries who have been invited, a substantial number of these countries are first developing countries, major countries in the global south, and countries from the Indo-Pacific. Of course, there are exceptions like Brazil, but largely if you look at India, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Korea, these are countries who play an important part of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, earlier this year, we saw the Japanese Prime Minister being in India, and from New Delhi, he laid out his vision of the Indo-Pacific, in which he sees India playing a key role, and also on connectivity. For example, Matabari port in Bangladesh is something the Japanese are banking on. So, largely, the Japanese side, by inviting this set of country, the set of country is trying to focus on the larger Indo-Pacific region, which is a region which is Japan's neighborhood, and how Japan can help in connectivity in the region and making sure that this is a region which is free and open. Now, by the usage of word free and open, it is a message to China itself, which has been staking its claim from various regions, from Senkaku Islands in Japan to South China Sea to, of course, the skirmishes we have seen in last 2 years with the Indian side at the line of actual control in the northern borders of India. So that remains a key issue as well during this summit. And with countries who have been invited, whether it's India, Australia, this will be part of conversation. We know, as we have talked about with India, the Chinese side has been aggressive. With Australia, the Chinese side has been using trade trade in a way which, of course, the Australian side is not very happy. They have been terming it as weaponization of trade. So this is something that will be focused. We saw yesterday there were conversations between the Japanese Prime Minister and several of his counterparts, including the British Prime Minister, the American President. And if you look at the readout from Tokyo, the readout specifically pointed to the challenges because of China. Now, usually readouts are boring. They do not reveal many things. But the fact that the Japanese readout has mentioned China showcases how that is a worry. So with these partner countries as well, China worry will be topping the priority.
That is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Sibol, who is live in Hiroshima at the Peace Memorial Park in Japan. And this is still live at the Peace Memorial Park, where leaders are now planting trees after laying wreaths at the Peace Memorial Park and posing for a photo op just before the plenary of the three-day summit begins. I will tell you about this summit. The annual Group of 7 summit has officially kicked off in Hiroshima, Japan. Leaders of the 7 major industrial democracies, which are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States, will be discussing the future of global relations and the world economy as it faces a number of uncertainties, growing geopolitical tensions, central banks' combat against rising inflation, and a U.S. debt ceiling deadlock. Sidhan Sibol, we also understand that Chinese President Xi Jinping has organized another summit of Asian leaders. Do we know more about that?
Well, I believe it's a meeting regarding the Central Asian leaders, which has been part of a conversation between China and Central Asian leaders. Now, China sees Central Asia as its own backyard. We know that there have been past attempts to increase engagement. In fact, China's Belt and Road Initiative passes to that part of the world, and usually we have seen countries engaging with the entire region in a specific block. Now, India in the past, just few months ago, saw the engagement at the NSA level and of course the leaders level as well. But largely, while G7 meets, China has its own focus areas. For example, the BRICS summit that is going to happen in the month of August. Then of course the SCO summit, of which India is the chair. The summit happens in New Delhi in the month of July. So while there are separate groupings, whether it's G7, which is seen as primarily a Western grouping, there are other groupings like SCO and BRICS, which are seen as the new emerging groupings, and more countries are keen to join, especially from the global south, in these groupings. In fact, the Sherpa of the BRICS grouping spoke to WION and said that he has got requests from approximately 19 countries to join the grouping. So that shows that while at one point G7 was seen as a major grouping of the most developed countries, new groupings pose challenge to these groupings which have been part of the global governance. Now, in the past, the defining aspect of G7 has been the economic might of the grouping combined together, the output, the GDP of the grouping. But remember, the BRICS have already taken over the combined output of the G7 grouping. So the rationale of G7, many would ask, what's the rationale now? It looks like largely a Western grouping, but a grouping which is willing to perhaps change as well. There have been murmurs in the past of expansion of the grouping to make it D10 as well, with inclusion of India. And while since 2003 there have been invitations to both India and China, we have seen in past decade the invitation being extended to India only. India, of course, has been a regular invitee since 2019. The Indian Prime Minister was invited first by the French in 2019. Then, of course, he participated at the summit in UK virtually. Then, of course, it was Germany last year, and this year it is Japan. And no surprises when it comes to Japan. Japan is a close partner of India, and when it comes to extending the invite, the Japanese Prime Minister was in New Delhi earlier this year and publicly announced that he's extending the invite for India when it comes to the G7 summit. So focus many things, but how China basically manages its relationship with the countries in the region and how it looks as looks at the outcome of the G7 is something that is given.
All right, that is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibol, live in Hiroshima, Japan. Thank you very much, Siddhant. We'll be coming back to you in our later bulletins just to get a sense of what is happening in Japan. And the Hiroshima summit has kicked off in Japan under the spotlight of the countries invited for the gathering, which include Australia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Korea and Vietnam, which have been invited there as observer states for the this most crucial and important summit currently happening in Hiroshima, Japan. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.